Unperson. A Generation Loss AU and Story, written, illustrated, and narrated by Molish. Chapter 3. Siren's Song. "Are you sure we're headed in the right direction?" Sneak grumbled as he trudged slowly through the thick powdered snow. He and Charlie had been walking through the dense forests of the Siberian taiga for several hours now, burning precious energy in sunlight. While the scenery was indeed beautiful, emerald fir trees dusted in sparkling white, blue mountains rising in the distance through the mist, the flash of an eagle's wing circling high above, both of them focused solely upon the task of tracking down something viable to eat and keeping their limbs from freezing in the frigid climate. Some distance up ahead, Charlie marched onwards, scanning the land around him with great intent. "I'm sure. Those tracks were heading north. We need to keep moving if we don't want to lose it." He paused a second and looked back at his companion who had fallen behind. "You good?" His eyes panned down to the makeshift bandage that he had given to Sneak to wrap around his leg. He could see a spot of blood beginning to seep through it, but the rag wasn't fully saturated with it yet, at least. "How's your leg doing?" Sneak grunted and picked up his pace, lightly shoulder-checking Charlie as he passed him. "It's fine. Just grazed, remember? Besides, you said we can't stop or we'd lose the deer. I'm fucking starving, so there's no way I'm taking a breather just yet." Charlie rolled his eyes and began walking again. "Not just a deer, a moose. Those tracks were large enough, easily." He squinted as he scrutinized the snow-covered underbrush, eyeing the little patches of green shrubs that poked their tiny leaves and twigs out from under the blanket of white. Upon seeing one area that looked particularly disturbed, Charlie's face lit up as his eyes landed upon a forlorn-looking plant whose leaves were considerably more chewed upon. "There! It was here, and recently, too. We are headed the right way." Sneak turned back around to face his fellow traveler, breathing heavily. "Aight, if you say so." He held out his arm, inviting Charlie to go first. "Lead the way, Bear Grylls. But if we don't find it soon, I think my stomach will start to eat me." The pair trekked together in silence, shivering yet determined, motivated equally by hunger and by hope. Despite the gradual waning of the latter and the growing of the former, they continued to press onwards through the forest. After another half-hour of arduous hiking, Charlie stopped dead and held up his hand, halting Sneak in his tracks. He held a finger up to his lips and pointed towards a clearing up ahead. A young bull moose, not yet old enough to have grown or have already shed its antlers, stood facing away from them while chewing lazily on a mouthful of shrubbery. To both Sneak and Charlie's surprise, it hadn't yet noticed their presence. Charlie gave Sneak a thumbs up and crouched low to the ground, hiding himself behind a snowbank. Sneak followed suit, and as slowly and quietly as he could, he took the coil rifle from his back. The young moose flicked an ear, but otherwise didn't seem spooked. Sneak took in a deep, slow breath as he switched on the rifle, and a low electrical hum rose in pitch as the voltage increased and created the internal magnetic field. Ever so carefully, he raised the rifle until the sight at its tip lined up perfectly with the grazer's skull. Upon exhaling, he pulled the trigger. There was no loud gunshot, for the coil rifle functioned more like a high-powered electromagnetic slingshot, but it still fulfilled its function just fine. The moose bellowed weakly before the sound was cut short by Sneak's ferro bullet as it passed directly through its brain. The grazer collapsed over on the ground, and one of its long legs stuck out to the side as it toppled over. It lay motionless, its life snatched instantly away. "Ah, hell yeah! Dinner!" Sneak cheered, stowing his rifle away on his back once more. Charlie made his way over to the fallen animal, refraining from looking at its glassy eyes. He was saddened by the death of the young creature, yet equally also impressed by his companion's marksmanship. Poor thing. At least its death was quick. And Sneak's right. We're both starving, so at least it won't go to waste. "Right," Charlie said, grunting as he struggled to hoist up the carcass. While it was indeed a small and juvenile moose, it was still a moose, easily weighing just over 100 pounds. "Help me carry this guy to somewhere where we can build a fire. Then we rest." He glanced at the sky peeking through the branches above them, and took note of the wisps of orange and lemon clouds that passed overhead, signaling the onset of the sun's departure. Good timing, too. Any later and we would have lost our daylight. With Sneeg's aid, they wandered another 15 minutes or so until they had located a large and rocky outcropping that provided suitable enough shelter from the wind and snow. After the two set down the moose and stretched their aching limbs, Charlie turned back to Sneeg. "You like jerky?" Sneeg scoffed. "Do I look like a vegetarian to you? Of course I like jerky. But even if I didn't, I wouldn't care. I'm so hungry I'd eat a shoe just as gladly as if I'd been handed a platter by Gordon Ramsay." "Good," Charlie chuckled. "I'll start finding some stones and make a ring for the fire, while you start working on a tripod with those branches over there. After that, I'll get to work on prepping our friend here for smoking." He glanced around at the trees nearest to them and frowned. "Actually, on second thought, don't use those branches. The fur here is too much resin." He paused a second to think, and after a moment, his eyes lit up. "I saw some birch trees not too far from here. Those should work fine enough, as long as the wood's not green." Sneeg crossed his arms. "And chop them down with what, genius? My bare hands? I don't see an axe just conveniently lying around anywhere, and the busted portal knife certainly isn't going to be of any use." As he spoke, he pulled out the hilt of the broken knife from his pocket. Charlie scrutinized it. It did indeed look like a weird red stick of knotted wood, although the pommel end had a strange set of notches that he hadn't previously noticed. But Sneeg was right. The blade was shattered, and the tool was useless for the present situation. Charlie rolled his eyes, unsheathed his own combat knife, and held it out hilt first towards Sneeg. "Use this. We don't need a whole trunk. Just get as many sticks as you can." "Fine. I'll try not to blunt it," Sneeg said as he snatched the knife and began to head off in the direction Charlie pointed him towards. "Don't go too far. And remember, no green sticks," Charlie called after him. For the next half hour, the two worked together to create a crude meat-smoking setup. Charlie scavenged the area for stones suitable to build a ring for their fire, and Sneeg foraged for any wood that was halfway passable for use as kindling. After several failed attempts, they were able to construct a makeshift tripod and shelf out of the pile of birch sticks Sneeg had retrieved. The fiery sky was just beginning to give way to the purple haze of dusk when they had finished their preparations. After handing the knife back to Charlie, who began to clean the blade to the best of his ability, Sneeg finally allowed himself to sit down and rest with his back against one of the rocks. He took off his hat and headphones, laying the former on the ground beside him and the latter around his neck, and wiped the sweat-soaked hair from his eyes. A deep sigh escaped from him, exhaustion etched deeply onto his face. After a moment, Sneeg turned his head to watch Charlie struggle to drag the body of the moose calf to a slab of stone a few meters away. "So, what exactly are you gonna do with it?" Charlie twirled the knife in his hand. "Clean and butcher it. Unless you'd like to gnaw on its leg while it's still raw or something." Sneeg ignored the quip. "Do you even know how to?" Charlie paused what he was doing for a second. He had just been about to make an incision to remove the organs from the carcass like he'd been accustomed to butchering animals for years, which, despite his hazy memory, he was sure wasn't the case. "I just have a feeling, like you with your funky cyberpunk engineering knowledge." I guess another one of those passive skills Shofal gave you finally came to light then, huh?" "Ah, right. Video game. Forgot about that. I suppose, speaking of which, how are you holding up, temperature-wise?" Sneeg pulled the fabric of his jacket more tightly around himself and raised up his cloth mask in response. "Could be better. I could really go for a hot shower right about now, but I won't freeze to death if that's what you're asking. Whatever plasticky material my fit is made of actually has some pretty good insulation. What about you?" Charlie smiled humorlessly. "I'm delightful, obviously. Couldn't be better. Living the dream." "Same here. I'm not comfy by any means, but I think what you said before about me having some kind of innate cold resistance must have been right." Despite his words, the frigid climate still burrowed deeply under Charlie's skin, causing him to shiver. In spite of this, he removed his body armor and gambeson jacket, rolled up the sleeves of his linen shirt, and readied his blade in preparation to begin his work. "I'd look the other way if I were you." With the skill and speed of an expert huntsman, Charlie sliced open the carcass from the beast's stomach all the way up to its breastbone. He didn't flinch as he reached his arms all the way up into the chest cavity to remove the heart and lungs, followed by the rest of the entrails, taking great care not to puncture the intestines. After cutting the head and legs free with some considerable effort, while avoiding looking the creature in its dull, lifeless eyes, he propped the torso up with difficulty and allowed the blood to drain for a while. Charlie knew he had to work quickly if he wanted to take advantage of the last rays of the sun before it dipped completely beyond the horizon. He took his blade and began to skin the calf, increasing his pace while dexterously separating the hide from the flesh. Only after this arduous cleaning process was complete, he was at last ready to begin butchering the meat itself. Sneak had long ago succumbed to the embrace of sleep. His snoring had started almost as soon as Charlie had begun his work, and he only began to stir when the smell of fire-roasted moose venison reached his nostrils. "Hey, yo!" he yawned, rubbing his eyes and pulling down his mask to get a better whiff. "That smells fucking delicious, man! Arby's could only dream!" He looked over at the crackling fire with several skewers of fresh moose flank hanging over it, and nearly jumped out of his skin when he saw Charlie sitting on the opposite side of the blaze. Despite the additional chill the night had brought on, Charlie's top half was still only covered by his linen shirt, and it was absolutely dripping with blood. Some of it was smeared on his neck and face, like he had scratched an itch while forgetting that his hands were still spattered with gore. The firelight glinted off of his glasses, obscuring his eyes behind an eerie orange glow. "Holy shit, Charlie! You scared the hell out of me! You do know you're covered in blood, right? You maybe want to wash the moose bits off of you before chowing down?" Charlie blinked like he had just been deep in thought, and moved his head to an angle at which the light no longer reflected so brightly from his lenses. "Sorry about that. I just needed to sit for a moment. I kind of forgot about, this." He chuckled and proceeded to wiggle his fingers out in front of him like a cartoon ghost. "Ooh, I'm a spooky ghoul. I'm gonna eat your brains." The sheer ridiculousness of Charlie's childish exclamation, combined with the absurdity of their reality and the horrors they'd recently endured, reduced them both to tears of genuine laughter. "Who the hell needs brains when we have a whole moose?" Sneak exclaimed. "I don't care if it's too hot. I'm not waiting a moment longer." He immediately proceeded to snatch up one of the skewers of venison steak from the makeshift rack and started to munch on it. Charlie, equally ravenous, plucked up another and followed suit. It wasn't long before they had polished off several more between them. Once their hunger was finally satisfied, a sensation neither had felt in quite some time, they began to swap stories for a while. They recounted their experiences from the past few days in greater detail, and both also attempted to bring to light any earlier memories by way of conversation, although neither were confident about whether those memories were true recollections or, instead, mere fantasies or nightmares. "You know, you seemed vaguely familiar to me when I first saw you after your fall from the rift," Charlie remarked. "I couldn't for the life of me tell you from where, but I just know that I've met you before. Don't know where, don't know when, but I just have. I know it." "Same here," Sneak replied, scratching his chin. "When you asked me why I protected you from my bike exploding, and I said that it was just because you didn't seem like one of those showfall guys, that was only partially true. I mostly did it because your mug also rang a bell for me. Or, at least, when it wasn't covered in moose blood, that is." "Oh!" Charlie exclaimed. "Right. I'd better see if I can clean some of this off, huh?" He got to his feet and walked a short distance from the fire to a nearby snowbank. "Don't mind me," he said as he peeled off the heavily blood-stained garment and began to scrub it with hands of densely packed snow. The firelight danced off of Charlie's back, illuminating the dark bruising that had begun to form there the previous night, thanks to the nasty tumble he had taken from the ladder in the prison factory. But the fire glinted off of something else that caught Sneak's eye. "Dude, I think you've got something on your back there. Multiple somethings." His eyes narrowed and his expression darkened. "What are those?" Charlie dropped the shirt he was holding and ran his hand over the back of his neck and over his shoulder. Sneak was right. He did feel something. "What the hell? How long have those been there?" At the nape of his neck was a small circular metal port. It dipped inwards a little, like some kind of socket. He moved his hand farther down his spine and located another right between his shoulder blades, and a third, slightly smaller, in the middle of where the back of his ribcage would be. "What the fuck? How the hell did I not notice these before?" then again, I've kind of been fighting for my survival up until now. Charlie heard Sneak drop his headphones to the ground and watched as he whirled around, trying to look over his shoulder while fighting with the bountiful material of his jacket. Holy shit, man! I have him too? Charlie walked back over to the fire and took a look at the back of Sneak's neck. Just he'd said, he also had 3 small metal ports embedded into his spine. Dread began to take root once more in Charlie's breast. Man, when you said you felt like Neo from the Matrix earlier, I didn't think you meant, like, literally. He began to pace back and forth in front of the fire, panic seeping into his speech. Were we in those, like, pods or something? Did they have us plugged in? And plugged into what? What if we're feeding a civilization of machines out in the real world? Or is this the real world, if we're already disconnected? And what if there's other people out there? What if there's nobody out there, and we're all that's left? What if... Charlie! Sneak cut him off by clamping both hands firmly down onto his shoulders. Breathe. Just breathe, man, okay? Breathe. Charlie looked frantically from one eye to the other and trembled as he stood, and not just from the cold. Let's review what we know so far, okay? Sneak said, his voice stern, but not without kindness. Charlie nodded and drew in a shaky breath. We're in a video game, or something like a video game. Neither of us can remember much of anything from before we first woke up in our respective realms. Both of us are capable of things that we were sure we had not been capable of doing before. Monsters exist here, but we can kill them. Right? Charlie nodded again, tentatively. Right. Some group called Showfall is in charge of all of this, but we don't know to what extent or why, only that they're the bad guys. Both of us are here, right now, alive, and not being actively chased by monsters. Sneak sat Charlie down next to the fire and brought over the stained shirt he'd dropped along with the quilted gambeson jacket he'd set down earlier, and, after glancing at him for permission, wrapped them around his shoulders. You and I, we're getting out of here, all right? That's all we need to focus on at the moment. There's no point in dwelling on hypotheticals right now. It'll only freak us both out further. Charlie stared forward and bit his lip. If we're in a game, all we need to do is survive until it ends, right? We'll just continue to take it one step at a time. We've come this far, you and I. Just breathe. He's right. We're alive and relatively unscathed. For now, at least. What matters most right now is focusing on survival and finding an exit. Survive and keep moving. Survive and keep moving. That's it. The two sat in silence for a minute while Charlie worked on slowing his breathing. After he'd calmed down somewhat, he pulled the stained shirt back over his head and tightly fastened the gambeson jacket on top of it. After his mind had stopped racing through nightmare scenarios at Mach 10, he slowly regained awareness of how cold he actually was. The warmth from the added clothing and the heat from the still crackling fire provided a welcome respite. I think, Charlie said in a quiet voice that made him sound small and meek, despite the contrasting appearance of the blood that still marred his face. I think we'd probably both benefit from some sleep. He turned his head to look over to the slab where he'd butchered the young moose, blackened by blood in the moonlight. There's so much left, but we won't be able to carry it all. The head of the grazer, decapitated by his hands, stared at him with glassy eyes, cold and unseeing. I'm sorry that this is all your short life amounted to. Charlie returned his gaze to the light of the fire. I prepared some slivers that we can smoke while we sleep, that we can take with us for rations. The rest we'll just have to leave behind. Sneak nodded. Aight, sounds like a plan. You get some rest now. I'll take first watch. Sneak grunted as he pulled himself slowly to his feet and shouldered his rifle. Despite Charlie's mental and physical exhaustion, it did not escape his notice that his companion continued to limp when he walked, and that he evidently tried to keep the pressure off of his wounded leg when he stood still. But Charlie didn't comment. What good would it do, pointing out the obvious? Fatigue weighed heavily upon his mind and body like lead, and very quickly dragged him down into a deep and fitful sleep. In the darkness of oblivion, Charlie saw nothing but a pair of black, lifeless eyes staring back at him, a reflection of morning. He ran. He had been running for hours, moving ceaselessly without a thought as to where he might be going. Rambu's mind was far too occupied by the pandemonium in his head, the clash of conflicting thoughts, feelings, and voices that collided with each other in a perfect storm of emotion, overpowering any attempt to rationally process what had happened since he had been reawoken from a sleep that should have been everlasting, never to be disturbed. He had been free, but they pulled him back, denying him his final rest. Despite running for miles without hindrance, unchained and unpursued, he felt more trapped than ever before, a prisoner of his own body, his own mind. Why? Why did they bring me back? They were given a choice, and they made it. Why go back on it now? But there never really was a choice, was there? The thumping of his mechanical limbs as he galloped on all fours through dense drifts of snow combined with the rapid beating of his heart, adding to the cacophony that was already ever present in his mind. He could feel the blood as it pulsed through his veins, flowing as prominently as if he were wading through river rapids. Rambo had lost count of how many trees he had absent-mindedly collided with in his haste to keep moving, or how many times a branch had smacked into him and left a scratch as he passed. He didn't care. But I had a choice. What have I done? What have you done? He continued to thunder through the dense forests of who knows where, while the sky was set ablaze by the sun's rapid retreat beyond the horizon. As the light began to dim and the onset of dusk bathed the environment in purple and gold, Rambo barreled out from the forest and into a clearing. The sight of a stream of running water made him pause at last. He collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving from overexertion. After taking a minute to regain his breath, he slowly pulled himself through the frozen slush over to the riverbank. At its deepest, the water was perhaps waist-high. He was still stained with the blood from the drone he had eviscerated. It covered his body, metal and flesh alike, like paint on the canvas of a mad artist. His very being was tainted with the stench of iron. No matter how fast he ran or for how long, it lingered, tormenting his senses. Rambo hunched over the edge of the stream. In spite of the water's movement, the surface glistened and reflected his bloodied visage back at him like the surface of a perfectly polished mirror. He met his own eyes with a look that was something between fear and loathing. What did you do to them? His reflection didn't respond, but the gore that stained the edges of his mask was enough of an answer. Who were they? They weren't just a machine. You were wrong. You always get it wrong. Hetch lied to you. He's done nothing but lie to you. You knew. You saw. You should have known better. You should have stopped him. You could have saved that person's life. But no, you stole it from them, just like Shofall stole yours. You didn't just fail them. You betrayed them. You're no better than they are. Thief, liar, murderer, monster. With a shrill cry, Rambo slashed a clawed hand across the surface of the river, slicing his reflection to ribbons. He doused himself with freezing water as a result, but he couldn't care less about whether or not it would damage his circuitry, although, to his benefit, the wires appeared to be impermeable. The sound of his roar echoed through the trees, and a flock of dunnocks took to the air on panicked wings. He was about to try his hand at clawing at the mask again, in an attempt to remove it, but the port at the back of his neck where his mask was plugged directly into his nervous system began to burn at the very thought. The disciplinary trigger. It'll activate if I try anything self-destructive. Right. He looked down at his hands, still stained with crimson despite coming into contact with the river water. Their blood is on your hands. All of them. Sneeg, Charlie, Nikki. Not just that drone. They probably weren't even a drone, just some random person, forced to be there against their will. You know what that's like, and yet you made them suffer for the actions of another. Look at what you've become. You're just like them after all, sharing in their vision. Hetch was right about you. Tears once more began to burn at the corners of Rambo's eyes. No, he wasn't. I'm nothing like him. He may have forced me to come back into this, but I do not share his mind. He began to pace the length of the riverbank, up and down and back again while deepening his footprints in the mud and snow. But if you can't avenge them, help your friends in any way, how different are you, really? You've done nothing but cower when they need you, and kill when unprovoked. You're no better than the animal they made you out to be. Shut up! Rambo shook his head rapidly, grunting in frustration. I'm not just an animal. I'm a person. They controlled me. I couldn't fight them. I didn't want any of this. It doesn't matter what you wanted. Your friends still died. You still killed, thinking it right to be judge, jury, and executioner. Just like them. Don't think you've forgotten about how it felt to drive that dagger into the heart of that drone back in the facility. They were going to hurt Charlie. You don't know that. Your pride blinded you, and you twisted the knife. You smiled, and you knew deep down that those weren't really wires. You knew. Rambo clasped his hands over his head, covering his face while he reeled. No, that's not true. I didn't know. You sure as hell knew the second time. If not when you first knocked them over with no resistance, pinning them down to prevent their escape, then certainly when you lacerated their body with your own hands. Certainly when you mauled through their face with your teeth nonetheless. Certainly when you ripped into their chest, tore out their heart, and— Stop it! He fell over backwards into the muddied snow, writhing in turmoil. It felt good, didn't it? To give them a taste of their own medicine. Tell me, how exactly did that medicine taste? You swallowed it whole, did you not? Retching, Rambo began to curl himself into a ball as the sky above him darkened. Stop it, please! No! You didn't stop, did you? You didn't stop until you had glutted yourself. It's not vengeance you're after. You don't get to lionize yourself. You just wanted to satisfy your primal cravings, and you did just that. Morality be damned, you are just a fucking animal. He threw himself into the stream and thrashed about, venting his anguish through a continuous bellow that was stifled somewhat by the frigid waters. Coupled with the cold shock, the tormented noise, inhuman as it was, sufficed to silence the reviling voice in his head. The salt from his tears was diluted by the freshwater current, but the sting was just as potent as ever. After a minute or so of this, although it felt to Rambo more like an eternity, he returned to the bank sopping wet, freezing, and miserable. He shivered, although the cold affected him far less than he expected it would, especially given his lack of sufficient clothing. His soaking wet tattered jeans, cropped above the knee and still irreparably stained from his own execution, hardly provided any meaningful protection from this kind of frozen climate. He sat on the bank for some time, focusing solely on stabilizing his breathing and heart rate, long past when the last rays of the sun licked the horizon with their fiery hues. The world was rapidly descending into darkness around him, transitioning from dusky purple to abyssal blue. To his surprise, however, Rambo noticed that he could still see just fine in the blackness. It was only then that he also noticed that the gore that had previously smothered his body had been washed away by the stream. The metal plating on his forelimbs glinted softly in the moonlight. But still the smell of blood lingered, albeit faintly. This time, however, it wasn't coming from him. Rambo turned his head from side to side, cracking open the paneling on his mask ever so slightly to allow his newly acquired vomeral nasal organ to hone in on the scent. Where is that coming from? It's recent, whatever it is. Something in the back of his mind made him simultaneously hope for and pray against the notion that the trail of blood might lead him to one of his friends. He wanted desperately to find them, to do something, anything to help them, yet he fervently still wished that they were unharmed. Is that someone I know? Are they hurt? Or worse? There was only one way to find out. The devourer made its way into the darkness with the sole objective of tracking the scent of blood to its origin. The hunt had begun. Wakey, wakey, Sleeping Beauty. No eggs or bakey, though, I'm afraid. Charlie blinked and sat up groggily. Sneak was sitting on a rock a few meters away from the remains of the campfire, fastening his jacket. The sun was already up, but its light and warmth were obscured by thick gray clouds roiling the dull and dreary overcast sky. "How was your snooze?" Sneak asked as he donned his hat. Wearily, Charlie rubbed the sleep from his eyes and winced. His bruising felt more acute than before. "If I'm being honest, it was shit." "You look like shit, too, if I'm also being honest." Sneak grinned. "But at least you got some shut-eye. You needed it." Charlie looked at the dark circles under his companion's eyes and frowned. "Hold on, why didn't you wake me up sooner? I was supposed to take over the watch. Did you sleep at all?" Sneak waved his hand dismissively. "Hey, I rested while you took care of Bambi over there, remember? I'm fine." Charlie said nothing, but looked pointedly at Sneak's bandaged leg. The red splotch had grown overnight. "I said I'm fine," Sneak repeated tersely. In an obvious effort to change the subject, he pointed at the sky. "You notice that?" Charlie raised an eyebrow. "It's cloudy?" "Brilliant observation, Sherlock, but that's not what I'm getting at here. The sun is up. And it does that sometimes. In fact, it does that almost every day, if I'm not mistaken. Sneak groaned at the sarcastic quip and covered his face with his hand in exasperation. No, you idiot. It's not supposed to be up right now. You've only been asleep for a few hours. It proves that we're not actually in Siberia, or anywhere in a latitude that far north. There's too much snow around for it to be summer, and if we were actually there in the winter, it would still be dark. We should have had around 14 hours of nighttime at least. Huh. I didn't notice that before. Too busy running away from Soviet gas mask zombies to pay much attention to the day-night cycle, I guess. You're pretty observant. Sneed cracked a smug smile. And if I wasn't, I probably wouldn't be here right now. I like connecting the dots, unraveling puzzles. It pays to have studied in an interdisciplinary field like criminology. The smile immediately fell from his face, and his eyes unfocused. Charlie could tell his mind was moving at 100 miles a minute. You studied criminology? Charlie prodded carefully. Before all of this, I mean? Sneak's eyes returned from their 1,000-yard stare. I don't know. His brow creased, frustration plainly etched on his face. Why don't I know? It seemed so natural to say, but the more I try to think about it, the more obscure it gets. Like using high beams while driving in fog. Do you at least remember even going to university? Do you? Sneak retorted pointedly. Charlie went silent for a minute, trying to rack his brain for anything related to his life before Shofal's intervention, but his attempt to fish for memories was about as successful as if he had tried to bait for bass in a bathtub. He shook his head. Evidently also failing the same endeavor, Sneak stamped his foot like a petulant child and pulled up his hood. Ugh, it doesn't matter. Grab your shit, we've got a game to play. We're not going to advance very far by sitting on our asses and having yet another crisis. I don't think that's how that works, but Charlie decided to drop the subject for now. If you say so. The vagabond reached for his body armor and pulled it over his head. As he did so, his hand brushed lightly against one of the metal ports at the base of his neck, and his breath caught. He could feel the anxiety beginning to brew within him, but quickly forced his mind to refocus on suiting up and checking his equipment before it could bubble to the surface. After wrestling with the fastenings with shivering fingers, Charlie took stock of the strips of meat that had been smoked while he slept. He trimmed some down into smaller chunks and shoved as much as he could into his remaining pouches before offering the rest to Sneak, who proceeded to do the same. The two worked in silence to cover up the remains of the young moose's carcass, along with the ashes of their campfire with snow and leaves, obscuring as much of their presence as possible. I doubt those creatures followed us, as they likely would have tried to attack us while we were resting. But even so, it can't hurt to be cautious. We don't know what else could be lurking around out there. Right. Where to, Mr. Tracker Man? Sneak asked pointedly, hands resting on his hips. Charlie thought for a moment. I don't exactly have much of a clue as to where we should start. No roads, no weird animal sightings, no signs of human activity. I guess we should just pick a direction and walk? Sneak shrugged. This is your world, not mine. Lead on, boss man. For the next few hours, the vagabond and renegade trekked further through the dense forests of the landscape that masqueraded as a Siberian taiga. Through snow and ice they dragged their weary feet, and with each passing step the sky darkened as another storm loomed on the horizon. The clouds above became so thick that the atmosphere almost looked like a gargantuan slab of bone-white concrete, threatening to crash down upon the travelers' heads at any moment. They seldom engaged in conversation, excepting the one occasion in which Sneak tripped over a boulder hidden in the snow and landed on his wounded leg. Charlie voiced his concern and asked if he was all right, but as Charlie was growing to expect, Sneak merely brushed the question aside and prompted him to keep moving. During the course of the next 3 hours, they only paused once to catch their breaths and nibble at their rations. As they trudged onwards, the clouds above swelled and a thick fog began to roll in, cold and pervasive. Charlie noticed the density of the trees around them begin to lessen as they continued to march onwards, and it wasn't long before he and his companion broke free from the forest entirely. In front of them stretched a massive lake, the surface of which was frozen solid and covered in a thin layer of snow. The looming gray clouds above, combined with the mist which grew more opaque by the minute, caused the atmosphere around them to adopt the appearance of an icy void, and shrouded the other side of the lake from view. The travelers gradually slowed their trek to a pause at the lake's edge. As empty whiteness blanketed the world, silence fell with it. It was Sneak who broke it first. If it weren't for the subtle cerulean glow of the embellishments of his jacket and headphones, he would have appeared to be nothing more than a vague blob at any greater distance. Charlie? Don't you think it would be a good idea to stop somewhere more sheltered? Not that I dislike the idea of camping out in an ominous void on top of a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere, but I dislike the idea of camping out in an ominous void on top of a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere. Charlie couldn't quite place his finger on it, but he knew that something was close. Something important. The feeling wasn't dictated by reason, or instinct, or paranoia, or anything else that Charlie could pinpoint, but somehow he just knew. He recalled the conversation he and Sneak had had the night before. Just a little bit farther. We need to keep moving. Sneak looked at him like he'd just spoken in some kind of alien tongue. Dude, are you nuts? I know you have some funky cold resistance powers, but I don't. Nothing's chasing us right now. We shouldn't force ourselves to risk this storm and die by falling through the ice when we don't have to. I just have a feeling. Trust me. Whatever it is, it's not far, and it's important. Sneak shook his head in disbelief. You want us to keep walking into an oncoming snowstorm and risk our lives because something on that lake might be important? And your only source is, dude, trust me? Charlie looked at him with imploring gray eyes. I just know, man. Maybe it's another video game sense or whatever. This is my world after all, as you said. Sneak pinched the bridge of his nose and frowned, then threw his hands up in surrender. Fine. Video game logic and all that. I just hope you're right, and don't get us both iced, in every sense of the word. I sure hope so, too. Still, I'd rather die via hypothermia than by being eaten alive by one of those masked monstrosities. Charlie took a tentative step onto the snow-covered ice, and was relieved to find that it was quite thick and relatively stable. Followed closely behind by Sneak, he took another, then another, and soon the shore behind them faded away into the murk of the rapidly thickening fog. Aside from the rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch of their cautious footsteps and their wearied breathing, the world was eerily silent. 10 or so minutes later, Charlie halted dead in his tracks. Sneak lightly bumped into him and was about to open his mouth to ask why they'd stopped when Charlie shushed him. Shh! You hear that? He whispered, looking around. Sneak's eyes widened. Hear what? He whispered back, voice low but anxious. Charlie strained his eyes and ears as much as he could, turning around several times and losing all sense of direction. He could have sworn that he'd heard a voice in the fog. A faint hum pierced softly through the gray expanse. There! Charlie whispered, pointing towards where the voice was emanating from. Is that someone singing? He made sure that Sneak was following closely behind him and began to walk slowly towards the faint melody. The voice was low, dark, yet sweet. It was feminine and lightly accented with a German lilt. My breast is cold as clay, my breath is earthly strong, and if you kiss my cold clay lips, your days they won't be long. Charlie's heartbeat quickened. There is someone there. We're not alone. His mind was bombarded by a flood of questions. Did she escape from the same place that I did? Did she also have to flee from those monsters? Is she hurt? The bruising on his back began to throb slightly, as if to remind him of his own injuries. As they moved closer, the verse continued. How oft on yonder grave, sweetheart, where we were wont to walk, the fairest flower that e'er I saw has withered to a stalk. Behind him, Sneak was growing more anxious by the second. He softly tapped Charlie's shoulder, and when he turned around, gripped it tightly. Are you sure this is a good idea? He hissed. Charlie nodded and whispered back. This is what I was feeling before. I know that whoever this person is, she's important. Regardless, what if she needs help? Or she could help us? Sneak gave him a pained look, but ultimately nodded back. I don't like it, but okay. As soon as we find out who she is and do what we need to do, we leave and get somewhere sheltered. He was very clearly on edge, and Charlie didn't comment when Sneak silently took the rifle from his back and switched it on, holding it at the ready. Charlie decided to do the same, just as a precaution, and took his own pistol from its holster. Another verse from the haunting voice reached their ears.
When will we meet again, sweetheart? When will we meet again? When the autumn leaves that fall from trees are green and spring up again.
Charlie's eyes narrowed, almost entirely obscured by the fog, which now felt almost as thick as paint. He spied a dark splotch in the gloom ahead. Something prickled lightly at the back of his mind, like a tiny fishhook looking to snare a long-forgotten memory. That voice, why does it sound familiar? Did I know her before all of this? Like Sneak? Who is she? The humming stopped short, only to be replaced by stifled, reserved sobbing. Charlie immediately holstered his pistol again, but took note that Sneak elected not to do the same with his own weapon. They walked closer. The crunch, crunch, crunch of their footfalls on the snow-covered surface of the frozen lake seemed to echo in the bleak void around them. As they approached, the dark shape in the fog began to take a more defined form. Charlie could just about make out the top half of a person's silhouette. "It's so dark. It's so cold." The figure spoke softly, seemingly to herself. She appeared not to have noticed them yet. "Hello?" Charlie called out to her, tentatively. As an afterthought, he added, "We won't hurt you. We're friendly." The figure didn't turn around. "Help me," she rasped. "I can't see. It's so dark. It's so cold." Charlie walked a few steps farther. The figure was still obscured, but he could now make out the rough outline of a head and a feminine torso. Unkempt hair fell down her shoulders. Her back was still facing him. We're here to help. Can you tell us her name?" he asked, unease beginning to fester within him. Charlie jumped at the sound of Sneak yelping and falling behind him. The rifle clattered to the ground as Sneak braced his fall onto the ice, but to Charlie's relief it remained intact upon impact. He immediately bent down to help his friend to his feet, but the look on Sneak's face only made his unease grow even stronger. "What the hell was that, man?" Sneak said, panic rising in his voice. "Something touched my leg." Charlie looked around, but saw nothing except for the fog and the ice at their feet. "There's nothing there. You probably slipped on the ice or something." Sneak also looked around, and then back at Charlie, eyes wide with fear. "Then, where's the girl?" Charlie scrutinized the space where the figure had just been moments before, but there was nothing there but the white, empty void enveloped in complete silence, like some kind of frigid purgatory. The blood drained from his face. Suddenly, the silence was obliterated by a cacophony of shattering ice, the desperate screaming of his companion, and an inhuman wail that sounded like the unholy matrimony of a barn owl's screech and the ear-splitting whistle of a steam engine. Charlie whirled around just in time to see a dark blur whisk itself away into a massive hole in the ice with a splash. Sneak's rifle was laying on the ground before him. Charlie grabbed it and ran to the edge of the aperture to see the icy waters churning with bubbles, but there was no sign of his friend or whatever had taken him. Charlie fell backwards in surprise as another portion of the ice was noisily shattered just a short distance away, and Sneak's shrieking was heard once more. Fear was etched onto the vagabond's face as he watched his friend, his clothes soaking wet and bloodied, try desperately to crawl away from the hole in the ice. Out from the surface of the frothing waters, a head began to rise. Its skin was taut and jaundiced, looking for all the world like the aged flesh of a rotting fish. The sopping wet and matted hair that sprung from its scalp clung to its face and was split in two tones down the center, one dark and the other light, yellowed slightly with grime. The face in question was gaunt, marred by rot and filth, and its long and elongated lips stretched to frame a mouth that looked more akin to that of an eel than a person. Its eyes were what scared Charlie the most. Icily pale, clouded, and soulless, they stared forward without seeing, like those of the young animal he'd butchered not even a day prior. As Sneak yelled and continued his attempt to put as much distance between himself and the abomination as possible, Charlie noticed it angle its head towards the noise his friend was making. It twitched like it was honing in on the sound, and suddenly a massive blur shot from the ice with incomprehensible speed. Within milliseconds, Sneeg was pinned under the grasp of the metallic claws that were disproportionately long and wickedly sharp. The creature's torso was clad in wet and rotting rags that perhaps at one time might have sported a bright scarlet hue. Arms that had once been human were now an amalgamation of twisted flesh and rusted machinery. Multicolored wires weaved themselves through the creature's forearms, which ended in webbed robotic hands that were tipped with razor-sharp metallic digits. The torso ended abruptly at the hips, where a bed of tangled cables married the humanoid abdomen with a truly massive serpentine tail, like that of a mechanical naga or siren. It was formed of a mass of writhing wires and cylindrical segments of riveted and rusty metal which rotated independently of each other, and the tail was tipped with a heavily torn set of fins resembling those of a gargantuan barracuda. "Charlie! A little help over here!" Sneeg yelled, thrashing to free himself from the monster's grasp. Its face twitched to and fro as it bent over him, blind eyes staring unblinkingly ahead. Slowly, it began to open its jaws, revealing a menacing set of eel-like teeth as long and sharp as stilettos, flashing silver through the fog. "Charlie!" The vagabond snapped out of his shock-induced stupor and assessed the situation. "She can't see. If I make a loud enough commotion, maybe she'll leave him alone." He took stock of his own equipment, including the coil rifle that he held with quivering hands. "I'll have to use my own pistol. Sneeg's rifle is too quiet." He dropped the rifle to the ice beside him and unholstered the Red 9 from his belt. "Hey! Over here!" he shouted at the top of his lungs. The creature snapped its head in his direction, its nightmarish teeth still bared, but stayed put while Sneeg struggled on its claws. "Leave him alone!" Charlie yelled as he fired a shot towards it with a loud bang. His hands shook violently from the cold and the fear that gripped him like a vice, causing him to miss completely. Despite not having legs, the creature moved with surprising speed and agility and dodged the shot with ease. But nonetheless, Charlie had achieved the desired effect. The monster released Sneeg and lunged for him instead. Oh shit! Faster than his mind could process what was happening, Charlie was impacted by a force that felt almost as powerful as if he'd been hit by a tidal wave. One moment he was standing with both of his feet firmly planted on the ground, pistol raised heroically in front of him in defense of his friend, and the next, he found himself plunged into water so cold it burned. All of the air was knocked completely from his lungs. A few seconds later, he was thrown back onto the surface of the ice with the care and gentleness one would give to a dead fish. He coughed and spluttered, trying desperately to suck some oxygen back into his lungs. Claws of steel held down his chest and one of his arms, but the other, miraculously, was free and still clutched tightly onto the grip of the Mauser like it was a lifeline. "You may have taken my eyes," it rasped with a voice like sandpaper, "but you will never take my voice again." It bellowed at him with a deep-seated and grief-filled rage that Charlie couldn't begin to comprehend. "I will not be silenced!" "What?" Charlie spluttered, trying to expunge the water from his lungs. I don't even know who you are, let alone what happened to your eyes, or the rest of you for that matter." It hissed in response. "You lie! You all lie! All you do is lie! Lie and never listen!" The monster loomed over him, jaws agape, eyes clouded and lacking any hint of warmth. It couldn't see as Charlie raised his pistol, aiming it at its heart. But something stopped him from pulling the trigger. Those eyes, those soulless, dead eyes. While they may have been devoid of humanity, they weren't completely alien to him. "Just shoot!" his rational mind screamed at him. "Save yourself!" The face twitched, stooping ever closer. At this distance, Charlie could make out a series of dark marks and deep scarring that ran down from its eyes to its cheeks. They looked almost like tear stains, if tears were made of molten tar rather than water. "Shoot it, Charlie! Just shoot it!" Sneeg yelled at him from some distance away, panicked and in pain, obscured by the fog. But Charlie ignored him. Something flashed in his mind. It was quick, like the fleeting scales of a fish in a pond, but it was enough. Ever so briefly, he saw the smiling visage of a woman in red. Her face radiated amicability. He heard her voice reading scary stories in German to an audience behind the camera. He heard. He saw. He knew. He did know her. "Pull the damn trigger!" I can't. He dropped the pistol to his side, hoping to attempt to reason with her, to make her see that he was not going to hurt her, that he was a friend, and that, in some other time, in some other place, she had been his friend too. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper. As soon as the sound of his words passed his lips and reached her ears, her unseeing eyes locked onto his. For a split second, he thought he had reached her, until she lunged at him and tore out his throat. Game over. Deaths 1. Level 2. Hero variant, Vagabond. Companion variant, Renegade. Anathema slain, 5. Abomination slain, 0. Try again. The devourer loped through the dense forest of fir trees, hindered neither by the clouds that obscured the faint light of the moon and swathed everything in darkness, nor the frigid air that wanted to bore deep into his bones and leach him of all of his warmth, but somehow did not seem capable of doing so. He had been following the scent of blood for over an hour, focused and diligent like a well-trained bloodhound on the trail of a game animal. Keeping his mind centered on this one task helped to keep his consciousness from unraveling, from fracturing into a host of angry, discordant voices that yelled at each other, berating both him and themselves for past and present thoughts and actions. Find the source. Just find the source. One step at a time. Just find the source. The forest opened abruptly into a massive man-made clearing. The trunks of the surrounding trees had been roughly hewn down by hand, although that was evidently some time ago, given that most of these stumps had since been either overgrown or completely covered by snow. The trunks themselves were not hard to find. Rambu halted, for his way was barred by a tall palisade made of sharpened wood and reinforced metal that ringed a large camp of some sort. He shrank into the shadows, straining his ears for signs of life. Nothing. Maybe it's abandoned? Upon closer inspection, he noticed that the palisade was rotten. After walking down its length for a minute, he found several areas where the wooden logs and rusted metal had fallen away entirely, opening up a path into the camp itself. Rambu cracked open his mask and breathed deeply, sucking in the frigid air and the myriad of scents from the surrounding environment with it. There's blood here. Lots of it, and spilt within the last day or so, but... He paused, his face twisting in mild disgust. That doesn't make sense. It's old. Very old. Fetid. Rotten. He prowled further into the camp, past a deteriorated barbed wire fence and between the ruins of crudely built structures that had long ago caved in and since began to rot. His attention was grabbed, however, by a rather obscure edifice at the center of the camp. It was massive, structurally sound, and looked quite out of place when compared to the rest of the crumbling buildings. What is this place? The snow leading out from the large facility was disturbed. Recently, too. Rambu saw signs of a struggle, and several tracks led away from the building and out towards another hole in the palisade wall. There was a fight here. Someone or something was chased from that building and into the forest. But this place has clearly otherwise been abandoned for a long time. Why was there anyone here at all recently? Scavenging for supplies? What were they running from? Rambu followed the tracks through the camp and saw something half buried in a mound of snow. As he approached, his eyes widened. It was a body, vaguely humanoid in form, but its limbs were entirely out of proportion and bent inwards at many unnatural angles, like those of a deceased insect. Rambu dug through the snow around it, raised a clawed hand, and cautiously pushed the body over to inspect it further. What the hell is that thing? He shuddered. Its head resembled some kind of old gas mask, with a tube or proboscis that looked more like an external trachea than anything else. A small hole was made in one side of the mask. On the opposite side, the face was completely obliterated. Aged blood and rotting gray matter stained the snow where it had fallen. That wound wasn't made by teeth or claws. It looks like a bullet of some kind. It must have been shot. His heart lifted a little at the thought of encountering another person, and he quickly followed the rest of the tracks to the edge of the camp to look for any further signs. He found a few more corpses of those odd creatures, but no fallen humans. Whoever killed these things might still be alive. The lights on his mask flashed ever so briefly, and the visages of familiar faces flickered through his mind. He strained his memory and brought the time he had spent in the media tower, before Hedge's betrayal, before he had broken Charlie from his content stupor. to the forefront of his consciousness. He remembered finding an exit and expressing his desire to leave and call the police for help, or frankly anyone who was better equipped to handle the shady dealings of a malicious entertainment organization. But Hetch had stopped him, convinced him to stay. He said that my friends were still alive, that they were all still alive somewhere. Sneeg, Charlie, Nikki, Austin, Ethan, Vinny. He knew where they were. His blood began to boil, and a noise of frustration left his throat. Bastard, of course he knew where they were. He put him there himself. Rambo shook his head and dug his claws into the snow. No, it's no use getting angry about it now. That won't help me to solve anything. He closed his eyes. The trail I was following didn't come from these things. Find the source. Just get a hold of yourself. Find the source. Rambo opened his eyes again, followed the tracks to the very edge of the camp, and saw that the area of disturbed snow went further into the forest beyond the camp's perimeter. Breathing deeply, he caught the original scent of fresher blood again, and noticed that the tracks led roughly in the same direction. The devourer collected itself and dove into the forest on the hunt once more. Over the next few hours, it took note of where the environment was disturbed. Every so often, it would spy a newly snapped branch or set of footprints in the snow. The dark night did little to hide the traces from the abomination's keen eyes, and the thought of sleep did not cross its mind once. Tirelessly, Rambo trekked onwards. He began to slow his gait only when his vomeral nasal organ picked up the scent of something other than trees, snow, and the faint traces of blood he'd been tracking. Is that smoke? It was the smell of charcoal, at least a day old. Rambo prowled around the area until he alighted upon a rocky outcropping, the rough and dark surface of which stood out against the whiteness of the snow that surrounded it. Underneath the outcropping, he discovered the blackened remains of a man-made fire. Someone was here. Recently. Likely the same person who came from that camp. He looked around, tasting the air. The burning smell lingered, and he realized that it wasn't just coming from the small bit of charcoal. He made his way towards another clearing not too far from the remnants of the fire, and immediately halted. Instead of seeing the remains of a larger campfire, as he had expected, Rambo was stunned by the appearance of a shallow crater, still smoking. The ground had been blackened by what looked like some kind of explosion, and had not yet been covered by snow. He could see the remnants of large chunks of metal, melted and twisted beyond any recognition. What the hell happened here? He feared for a moment that the person he'd been trailing had perished in whatever this blast was, but exhaled a sigh of relief upon noticing some tracks that led away from the explosion and back into the forest. Rambo paused for a moment to scrutinize them more closely. There's more than one set here. He looked around the clearing, but could not for the life of him find where the other set of tracks originated from. Where did that other person come from? It's like they just appeared here. His stomach growled, interrupting his train of thought for a moment. Rambo shook his head to clear it. Ugh, not now. I'll find something along the way. I can't lose them. Wherever they came from, they're now traveling together, that much is clear. It can't be far. The devourer took off once more into the forest. As it stalked through the trees, faint rays of sunlight began to creep over the horizon. The sky in the east began to shift from an inky blue to a burned violet to a soft rose, and clouds of orange clawed up from the horizon like talons of fire. The dense grey clouds amassing in the distance, however, failed to escape the devourer's notice. It won't be long until the entire sky is overcast. A couple of hours later, as the color drained from the environment, the land and sky seemed to melt together into a monochrome mass of grey and white, almost blindingly so due to the scattering of light through the clouds above. Still, the devourer pressed onwards, mind honed on the one task of pursuing its quarry. As the time passed, however, the dull but persistent presence of hunger lingered at the back of his psyche, faint yet never ceasing, like the scratching of a rat's tiny claws underneath the floorboards of an old house. Through the trees, Rambo caught sight of another large outcropping of rock. The smell of freshly spilled blood had grown stronger, but something else was added to it, something fetid. Something he was wounded, or perhaps dead. He stopped short upon hearing a noise other than his own footfalls and the rustling of fir needles in the breeze, and immediately shrank low to the ground. It was the familiar sound of the ripping and tearing of flesh, followed by something chewing. Something big. Whatever it is, it's got food. Rambo's heart began to beat faster in his chest, and he could feel the adrenaline as it began to seep into his veins. Slowly and quietly, with his chest low to the ground like a lion on the prowl, the devourer crawled towards the outcropping. As he silently rounded the edge of the rock, his breath caught and his eyes widened with shock. Feeding on what looked like the headless and legless corpse of a skinned grazer, possibly a deer, maybe even a small moose, was another, very much alive, skinned grazer. The monstrosity looked like a gargantuan flayed Clydesdale, with every inch of its muscles and tendons bare and exposed. Fused atop its back flopped the rotting torso of one of those creatures from the abandoned camp. Its freakishly long arms dragged along the ground, and its razor-thin fingers twitched with each subtle movement of the great beast beneath it. The creature's gas mask was flipped upwards, and the living tracheal tubing was grasping at the air like an elephant's trunk. The horse's face was obscured from view. It was bent over and tearing at its meal, while a deep series of chittering clicks emanated from its throat. A Nuka-la-vie. What the hell have I got myself into? In his bewilderment, Rambo accidentally stepped on a fallen twig. The noise was subtle, but it was enough. The flayed monstrosity paused its consumption, and both horse and rider snapped their heads in unison towards the devourer's position. Like the creature fused to its spine, the beast's head too resembled an old rotting gas mask, one fitted perfectly for its horrific equine visage. It detached its proboscis from within the corpse of the eviscerated animal, and it writhed and pulsated like the decapitated body of a snake. At its tip was a fleshy maw with 4 hooked fangs, like the mouth of a massive bloodworm, spattered with gore and dripping with saliva. It hissed at him, low and threatening, but remained in its place, guarding its meal. The devourer stared ahead, unblinking, deciding what to do next. Kill it. It could kill me. Do you want to starve? I can't get distracted. My friends might be hurt. I need to reach them before the trail goes cold. You can feel it, can't you? The itch, always there, lingering, scratching, biting. As if to emphasize the point, Rambo's stomach growled again. And it will not stop until either you have eaten or it eats you. Your friends can wait. Hunger is knocking at your door. Answer it. Besides, that thing is a monster. It exists solely to be slain. Kill it. Take what you need, what you deserve. The devourer raised itself onto its hind legs to make itself seem larger than it was, opened the paneling on its mask as far as it could go, and unleashed an ear-splitting mechanical roar at its opponent. The Nuka-la-vie screamed back, unfazed by the threat, and accepted the challenge. It charged at Rambo, swinging the long arms of the rider like clubs. Rambo dropped to the ground on all fours and ducked, narrowly avoiding having his head lopped off his shoulders. He snarled, and each of the plates on his mouth vibrated and clacked together threateningly. The horse swiveled in place, trying to kick Rambo's skull in with its massive hooves, but despite its hunger, the devourer was faster. It leapt to the side and swiped at the oblique muscles on the creature's exposed abdomen, and it shrieked as its own blood painted the snow with crimson. It kicked at its opponent again and missed, but just as the devourer ducked once more to avoid being trampled, the Nuka-la-vie caught him in the chest with one of its massive flailing arms. Rambo was thrown off of his feet, and his back collided with the rocky outcropping, knocking the wind from his lungs. He grunted and shook his head, trying to refocus his dazed mind, but the creature took this as an opportunity. The proboscis from the horse's mask lunged at him, latching its curved fangs into the flesh between his neck and shoulder, causing the devourer to roar in pain. But as the beast's maw began to writhe and burrow deeper into his skin, the devourer lunged back. Its own biomechanical jaws clamped down onto the living tubing and pulled downwards as hard as it could, tearing the proboscis from the mouth of the horse's mask completely. The Nuka-la-vie reeled and stumbled backwards while both horse and rider wailed in agony. The sound was almost deafening. The devourer wrenched the severed mouth from its neck, adding its own blood to the gory painting of the white canvas of the ground below. It launched itself at the other beast, gripping onto its sides with lacerating claws while biting at the body of the humanoid figure that was fused onto its back. The figure in question tried to bat the snapping metal jaws away, but this time its incredibly long arms proved to be a hindrance rather than a useful asset. It tried to latch onto the devourer with its own proboscis, but within seconds that too had been wrenched free of its corresponding mask. The Nuka-la-vie toppled over onto the ground, floundering and twitching as the devourer tore into its body. With one last mortal bite, the devourer closed its iron jaws around the gaunt waist of the flayed jockey, and with one cacophonous rending of flesh and bone, severed the horse and rider apart from each other for good. With no skin to contain it, the blood from the slain monstrosity, still convulsing on the ground, pooled into the snow, fetid, bubbling, and steaming. The devourer, still trembling with adrenaline, spat out the hunk of decaying flesh it held in its mouth. Putrid, rotten, inedible. Then leave it and take its prize instead. Take what is rightfully yours. Sate yourself. He walked over to the remains of the dismembered carcass that the creature had been feeding upon, limping slightly on his left arm from the wound he had received. The carcass looked like it had been dug out from the snow. In addition to missing its head and legs, all of its internal organs were also gone. It looked like it had already been bled dry and butchered. No matter. The devourer consumed what little meat was left, tearing at the body like a ravenous hyena that had stumbled upon a lion's leftovers. The pangs of hunger ebbed slightly, but the scant meal certainly wasn't enough to quell them completely. But at least it was something. Rambo shook the worst of the gore from his claws and cleaned them as best as he could in the snow. He tried to scrutinize the bite on his trapezius, but without a mirror he couldn't orient his head to see it properly. Shit, he winced. I hope that doesn't get infected. He had next to no training in first aid, but he knew that he had to get any dirt out from the wound itself to at least have a chance of preventing infection. For good measure, he crudely cleaned it with some fresh, unsullied snow and left it at that. He craned his neck upwards towards the sky. It was still gray and overcast, that was for certain, but the sun, at least, was still up. I need to get back on track. I need to find those travelers before something bad happens to them. If nothing bad has already happened, that is. The thought of possibly seeing one, if not more, of his friends alive once more spurred him on. Rambo closed his eyes, took in another deep breath, and began to reorient himself in the direction of the original scent he'd been tracking. There. As the sun crept across the sky devoid of color and began its gradual descent into the west, the devourer continued on its way through the frozen forest. A dense fog had begun to wend its way through the trees, further obscuring the already hazy landscape. Just as the sun dipped beyond the horizon and a colder darkness began to descend, the devourer followed the trail to where the forest ended and a massive frozen lake began. It had taken just one tentative step onto the ice when it paused, for from far out on the lake, in the middle of that expansive sea of mist, a gunshot and a chorus of muffled shouting reached its ears. Rambo's blood ran cold. Nicky? Sneak? Charlie? Continue from last autosave. Autosave. Abomination encounter. Sightless Siren. Loading. Charlie blinked. He was standing atop the ice on the frozen lake, pistol in hand, with Sneak standing cautiously at his back, his own coil rifle primed and ready to fire at a moment's notice. Charlie's body was cold, as was to be expected in a climate this frigid, while standing in the middle of a fog so dense he could barely see what was a few feet in front of him, but his mind was warm and clouded, like he had just awoken from a deep and dreamless sleep. Sneak nudged him lightly on the back, and, when Charlie turned to look at him, gestured forwards with his eyes, nervously. What had they been doing again? A melancholy melody drifted softly through the haze.
When will we meet again, sweetheart? When will we meet again? When the autumn leaves that fall from trees are green and spring up again.
That voice. An odd feeling possessed him, like déjà vu. Charlie took a few tentative steps forward and tightened his grip on his pistol. A shape began to take form in the mist ahead, and the lamentful humming was cut short as the figure began to sob quietly to herself. Something about this is familiar. Did I know her? Before all of this? The odd feeling that gripped him grew in intensity and was only added to by the anxiety that began to claw at the back of his mind. Something's wrong. It's so dark. It's so cold. The figure wept, not yet acknowledging their presence. Hello? Charlie called, almost automatically. We won't hurt you. We're friendly, he trailed off. No, that's not... He frowned, trying to concentrate. We were friends at some point, but then... Help me. The figure responded with a rasp, but didn't turn around. I can't see. It's so dark. So cold. Charlie's hands shook. I want to, but... No. This is wrong. She's not... This isn't... What's... He heard Sneeg yelp behind him, but instead of reacting in surprise to what should have been an unexpected noise, he immediately whirled around to stop his friend from falling flat upon the ice. First, nice catch. Second, what the hell just touched my leg? Sneeg panicked. Charlie glanced quickly back to where the silhouette in the fog had been only moments before, only to find that it had vanished from sight. Suddenly, without knowing how or why, the uncanny feeling Charlie felt brewing within him grew so strong to the point that it made him feel nauseous. We have to get out of here. Without a further thought, Charlie shoved Sneeg backwards as hard as he could, causing him to drop his rifle in surprise as the two of them toppled to the ground. Hey, what the f... Sneeg's exclamation was cut short as the ice where they had just been standing suddenly exploded outwards. Something large and lengthy shot out from the freezing waters with a speed that could rival that of a bullet, and landed with a metallic crunch onto the frozen surface. The siren flailed its massive biomechanical tail, like a horrific combination of a robotic snake, eel, and barracuda, about on the ice in an effort to reorient itself. As it turned, it unleashed a high-pitched series of cries that came in short, screeching bursts, like it was trying to echolocate in the same manner as a bat or a predatory whale. Sneeg would have shouted something in alarm if Charlie hadn't already muffled his mouth with his gloved hand. He grabbed Sneeg's attention, closed his eyes, and, with his other, drew an imaginary line across them before he opened them again and pointed directly at the shrieking monstrosity. Sneeg shifted his gaze frantically with wide eyes, clearly gripped by panic and confusion. To soundlessly re-articulate his point, Charlie made a gesture like he was zipping his lips. Only when Sneeg finally gave a nod did Charlie remove his hand from his mouth. "Where are you?" the siren shrieked as it searched for its quarry. Its voice was raw with emotion and strain. "You looked, but you never saw beneath the surface. You heard, but you never truly listened." What is she talking about? As noiselessly as he could, Charlie rolled onto his side and grasped a chunk of broken ice tightly in his free hand. "Why take my eyes, but leave my voice? Is that small comfort I offer all that I am valued for?" The twisted being clawed its way along the water's frozen surface. As it dragged its heavy robotic tail across the ice, the chorus of creaking metal masked whatever noise the two men made as they rose slowly to their feet, and Sneeg took the same opportunity to reclaim his fallen rifle. "Yet even then, you only chose to listen when it pleased you. You never cared. You never will." The siren paused and started to move its head in a series of sharp jerks like a blind owl, trying desperately to pick up any sound of movement. Charlie chose that moment to hurl the chunk of ice as hard and as far as he could. The second the ice hit the ground, the siren turned immediately in the direction of the noise and launched itself through the air like a viper striking at a mouse. It shrieked as it landed, enraged at having missed its prey. While it was distracted, Sneeg raised the barrel of his rifle, aimed, and fired. The ferro bullet ricocheted off of one of the thick, rotating metal cylinders that comprised the outer casing of the beast's tail. It hissed in surprise, smashed a hole in the ice, and disappeared into the frigid waters with a splash. The ricochet was louder than the shot itself had been, but it was not enough to have masked the original sound entirely. Charlie and Sneeg nervously scanned the ice for any signs of the siren swimming beneath them, but took care not to move their feet, lest they further betray their position. They held their breaths in silence, standing motionless for over a minute. After having neither heard nor seen a single trace of the creature in all that time, Sneeg took a single wary step forward. That was a mistake. Almost as soon as his foot touched the ice with a soft crunch, Sneeg was suddenly thrown off of his feet by a torrent of water and shattered ice as the siren shot out from the depths. Within seconds, it had him pinned beneath its wickedly sharp claws. Charlie's nausea grew more intense as his sense of déjà vu grew with it. "It's distracted. I've got to make my shot while it's distracted." He pointed the broom-handled pistol at the back of the Siren while it writhed and tried to sink its stiletto-like teeth into the renegade's neck. Charlie's hands shook, but he stilled his breathing and managed to get his grip under control for long enough to line up a single, clean shot. He fired. The bang reverberated over the lake, harmonized by the Siren's shriek as it flung itself off of its prey and flopped sideways onto the ice with a thud. The deep teals and grays of the frozen surface were stained with crimson from the creature's wound as dark blood leaked from its shoulder. Sneak recovered quickly and ran to retrieve his rifle, but discovered with dismay that the lake water had caused the magnetic field generator to short-circuit. As he did so, the Siren picked itself up from the ground with difficulty and turned its head in the direction of the vagabond, who still held his pistol out in front of him in the ready. The abomination began to worm its way towards him, rapidly picking up speed. "Shoot it!" Charlie's brain screamed at him. "Shoot it before it jumps at you again!" "Again? What do you mean again? It's only gone after Sneeg. Whatever, just pull the damn trigger!" But still, something held him back. It was that strange sense of familiarity, like looking at a photograph that was too faded to see any details clearly, but was still recognizable as containing a distant memory. The sensation was wiped clean as the Siren bodied him to the floor, knocking the air from his lungs and sending his glasses flying. It pinned one of his arms to the ice with its massive claws with ease. "All I wanted was to be heard," it hissed at him, seething with grief and rage. "To be seen for who and not just what I was." Charlie's grip remained tightly fastened on the pistol in his free arm, which the Siren could not see. The déjà vu-induced nausea he felt was now so strong he thought he was going to vomit. He became dimly aware of Sneeg's voice reaching his ears, screaming at him. "Just shoot it, Charlie!" The Siren's face drew closer. "You may have taken my eyes, but you will never take my voice from me again." He caught sight of those strange, tar-like tear stains on its cheeks, and he felt the sting of salt inexplicably well up in his own eyes as he drew the pistol up to his chest, aiming it directly upwards. As the Siren loomed over him and bared its teeth, Charlie leaned his head to the side onto the cold and unforgiving surface of the ice and squeezed his eyes shut. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice catching as a tidal wave of grief and guilt suddenly washed over him. "I will not be silent!" Bang! The shot was nearly deafening, but the silence that followed immediately after was louder still. The Siren convulsed for a brief moment before collapsing on top of Charlie, causing the pistol to slip from his hands. The bullet hole in the creature's throat drained its vital ichor onto the vagabond's breastplate, and the gore from its mutilated face spattered his own. The Siren's head rested lifelessly against his neck, heavy and cold, its clouded eyes now devoid of any light whatsoever. A living being was killed, mutilated, reduced to a soulless object by his own hands, and somehow he knew that this time had not been the first. Charlie's ears rang, and his head felt like it had been stuffed with straw. He stared forward, unseeing, a look of pure horror etched onto his face. Save for his trembling lips, he remained frozen, not even attempting to move out from underneath the corpse, despite the sheer weight of the metal that pressed down upon him. He was nearly overcome by the desire to dissolve into a fit of hysterical sobbing, fueled by a grief so profound yet so inexplicable to him, but still he remained motionless, like a fawn in headlights. "Not again. Not again. I didn't want to hurt her. Not anyone. Why is this happening? Why is this still happening to me?" Though his vision was blurred by tears that had welled but refused to fall, Charlie made out the form of Sneeg as he limped towards him through the fog, which had mysteriously begun to clear, along with the clouds overhead, almost as soon as the Siren had fallen. Without saying a word, Sneeg shoved the abomination's corpse off of his friend's body and grimaced as it rolled onto its back, displaying the horrific mortal wound left by the bullet that had entered through its throat and passed straight through its face. Sneeg knelt down and covered Charlie's shoulders with the extra material of his jacket and slowly helped him to sit up, although keeping him from collapsing again was difficult, given that his whole body was shaking like a leaf in a thunderstorm. Nausea was too overwhelming. Charlie retched until there was nothing left in his stomach and then continued to sit on the ice, trembling, staring into nothing. I've never killed a person before," he said almost inaudibly, after a long pause. Sneak shifted so that he knelt in front of him and tried to hold his gaze. "That was hardly a person, Charlie," he said softly. Charlie looked at him with bloodshot eyes, brimming with tears, his expression twinged with anger. "You're wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "Whatever they did to her, she was still in there. Somewhere. And I killed her." He covered his face with his hands. "You did what you had to do to survive. You saved yourself. And me. Whatever Shofall did to her, she clearly was not in her right mind." Sneak went to place a comforting hand on Charlie's shoulder, but he swatted it away. "You didn't listen to her. She was a victim, just like us. And I killed her." Sneak frowned. "And she would have killed you if you hadn't. She would have killed both of us. Would you have wanted that instead?" Charlie wiped the tears from his face and stared into the distance, his expression dark. He didn't respond. The renegade opted to slightly change the subject. "Speaking of which," he stood up, taking care to avoid putting too much pressure on his leg, as the wound had reopened and was already bleeding through the bandage that was now almost soaked through with lake water. "How did you know that she was going to burst through the ice? How'd you know to push me aside?" Charlie had wondered the same thing. After he had purged his stomach of its contents, that intense feeling of déjà vu had disappeared. Somehow, I've been here before. Done this before. But only up until the creature was killed. Sneak went to retrieve his friend's fallen glasses. While he was distracted, Charlie lifted up his gambeson and placed a hand on his lower back. The bruises he had received in his fall from the ladder in the factory were gone, but the little white scar on his side remained. Quickly, he pulled his gambeson back down and bit his lip. "I told you. I had a feeling." Sneak began to carefully search around the Siren's corpse. "You said you knew there was something important here, but you neglected to mention the blind, murderous cyber fish woman. Either you kept that tidbit of information from me on purpose, which honestly I could think of no reason why you would possibly do that, or there must have been some other way that you suddenly became endowed with that knowledge just before the fight. So, which is it?" "So far, Sneak has done nothing but help me. If he finds out I somehow respawned, like those cyborgs he killed in his own world, he might lose his trust in me. If he begins to see me as a threat..." He eyed the renegade's rifle and swallowed nervously. "He could just as easily kill me." Charlie thought quickly. "Chalk it up to quick reflexes and intuition? Maybe one of my new video game abilities just got unlocked." Sneak didn't seem entirely convinced by the answer, but something laying on the ice next to a dislodged panel from the Siren's tail glinted in the light of the setting sun and caught his attention. He bent over to examine it more closely, and then gingerly picked it up and held it out to Charlie, along with his glasses. "All right, then. Can your intuition tell us what the hell this is supposed to be?" Charlie shakily rose to his feet to take the strange object from Sneak's hands, and, after donning his glasses, which miraculously had remained undamaged, began to scrutinize it. It was made out of some kind of red metal that was cold to the touch. Unlike the paneling on the Siren's tail, there wasn't a hint of age or rust on it at all. In fact, it was completely spotless, and shone like it had been recently polished. The metal was twisted and notched to form some strange interlocking pattern. He thought for a second, and then his eyes widened as an idea struck him. "Can you hand me the broken hilt you have?" Sneak cocked an eyebrow. "Why?" "Just let me see something." Sneak rolled his eyes, but fished the broken portal knife out from one of his many jacket pockets anyway, and handed the hilt to Charlie. Charlie took it and held it up alongside the strange metal object. After turning the latter around a few times, he pressed the edge against the tip of the broken hilt, and they slotted together perfectly. "Ta-da!" he said, holding it up triumphantly, although the expression did little to mask the exhaustion in his weakened voice. "And what the fuck is that supposed to be?" Sneak's voice was incredulous, but his expression betrayed his genuinely impressed surprise. Charlie shrugged and handed the combined objects back. "I don't know. You can't deny that they do go together, though. Probably some kind of MacGuffin we should hang on to for later." "Boss dropped some loot, huh? All right, bet. Wouldn't hurt to at least bring it with us. Sneak turned around and surveyed the landscape. Most of the fog had burnt away at this point, and they found that not only had they made it almost across the entire lake, but that the lake itself was situated above a large valley in the distance. Ahead of them, they could hear the sound of a crashing waterfall just beyond a section of the ice that had broken off into sections at the edge of what was presumably a steep hill or even a cliff. A waterfall. "Come on," Sneak said. "If we reach the edge of the lake, we might be able to spot a way down into the valley. It'll be safer for us to camp out down there where it's more sheltered than to stay up here and risk falling through the ice." Charlie turned back to look at the fallen Siren. "Should we, I don't know, give her some kind of burial, at least?" Sneak shouldered his rifle and placed a hand on his hip. "If you want to lug that corpse all the way to the bottom of the valley where there might be some dirt, and then take the time to dig a hole deep enough and large enough for it to fit, be my guest. There's no way I can carry her by myself, or even with Sneak's help. He's right, of course. I just wish we didn't have to leave her here like this. It feels wrong." He knelt down next to the Siren's mutilated face. Charlie wanted to close her eyes at the very least, but upon reaching out his hand, he saw that she didn't have any eyelids to close. He slowly retracted his fingers and gave a long, melancholic sigh. "I'm sorry it had to be this way," he said softly. "I don't remember you, but I know you deserved better. It's over now." He picked up his bloodied pistol from where he had dropped it and placed it back into its holster. After taking a deep breath to steel himself, he turned back to Sneak. "Okay, let's go." As the two of them got closer to the edge of the frozen lake, they were able to see the valley before them in greater detail. A waterfall did indeed tumble out from underneath the ice over a near vertical drop into a river of running water below. The river in question snaked its way through the valley's expanse, and, several miles away, they spied a large clearing devoid of trees. At its very center blinked a single red light, like the kind found on a signal tower. At this distance, neither of them could make out any kind of structure that it was attached to, but there must have been something there. "Right then. I guess I know where we're headed." They were about to search for a way to begin their descent into the valley when a harrowing and beastly yet mechanical wail, rife with grief and ire, stopped them in their tracks. "They're alive! Oh my God, they're alive!" Rambu's eyes welled with tears at the thought of finally seeing his friends again. Maybe they could help each other. Maybe they could all finally leave this place and end this nightmare. For good. Through the mists, another gunshot rang out across the frozen lake. They're in trouble. Either they're shooting at something, or something is shooting at them. Either way, they need help. He paced anxiously at the edge of the frozen lake, wary of how sharp and heavy his mechanical limbs were. "I've got to get across the ice. If you fall in, you could drown. Is it worth the risk?" "Of course it's worth it. I've got to help my friends. They need me." "Just like you helped them last time? And what if you fail? What if you break the ice and you die anyway? Some help that would be." "I won't fail them. Not again. I won't let it happen." Rambu steeled himself and gingerly placed a clawed hand onto the surface of the frozen lake. Slowly, he began to apply more and more pressure to it. After seeing that the ice held firm without cracking, he took a step forward. Then another. Then another. "It seems thick enough to hold my weight. It should be safe as long as I don't trip and fall." As cautiously and quietly as it could manage, the devourer slinked through the mist across the frozen expanse. The only sounds that would have betrayed its presence was a soft click, click, click of its steel claws as they fell on the ice, and even that was near inaudible. As Rambu made his way across the lake, the dense fog slowly began to dissipate. The gunshots and shouting also subsided, and Rambu quickened his pace as worry began to set in. What if I'm too late? The crimson rays of the setting sun began to cut through the last of the mist, painting the ice with shades of glimmering violet and fiery orange. Up ahead, the light glinted off of the surface of something large and metallic. At this distance, the glare made whatever it was look like a pile of discarded scrap. Rambu's eyes narrowed. What is that? Where did they go? As he grew nearer to the strange mass of metal, he noticed several large holes in the ice and took care to avoid falling through them. He eyed the shards that surrounded them cautiously. It looks like something burst out from under the surface rather than above it. What could have that much power other than a machine? He expected the thing that had collapsed upon the surface of the lake to be a vehicle or a large drilling tool of some kind, but upon finally reaching it, he stopped short in dismay, a look of horror reflecting in his eyes. No. No. No, it can't be. It can't be happening again. Not again. It was Nikki. She was just lying there, on her side, dead on the ice, discarded like an unwanted puppet without its strings. Just like him, her face and torso were still recognizably her own, despite being far more gaunt and pale than the last time he had seen her alive in that god-forsaken warehouse. Her long, split-dyed hair fell loosely around her, obscuring half of her face and clinging to her blood-stained neck. While his own chest was bare to the elements, hers at least was clad by a tarnished white shirt and a frayed red jacket, possibly the remnants of the same clothes she had worn when she had been ruthlessly murdered back in the warehouse. The material on her shoulder was torn and bloodied around what looked like a bullet wound. That's where the resemblances to her old self ended, however. Much like Rambu, Nikki's forearms had been replaced by savage mechanical appendages, tipped with razor-sharp claws that had some kind of rubbery webbing between them. Instead of giving her legs the same treatment, however, Shofal had evidently gone with something more thematic. A massive snake-like tail tipped with aquatic fins, formed of cylindrical and rusted metal segments, between which a mass of multicolored wires poked through, began at her hips and lay bent and coiled upon the ice, unmoving. Why did they do this to you? Rambu thought, his vision blurring with tears. They already killed you once. Why put you through this again? It's not fair. Why are they doing this to us? That's rich talk. You just stood there when the puzzler shot her. Even when she cried for help, you didn't listen. You didn't do anything at all. Not even when he shot her again. No! Shofal was controlling me. I could barely move. I'm not responsible for what happened to her then, as heinous as it was. No. You were the one who freed her from the carousel and led her to her doom. That wasn't me. The audience chose her. But you were the one with the keys. The audience wasn't there to free her. You did that yourself. I thought she'd be saved. I wanted her to escape, for all of us to escape. It doesn't matter what you wanted. The consequences are still the same. She died. And look where we are now. You wanted to help her yet again. And again she's dead. Because of your failings. Good intentions are meaningless. Look where they led. Where they always lead. Nikki's last words echoed hauntingly in his mind. It's cold. I can't see anything. With trembling fingers and with the same care as if he were handling a hummingbird's nest, he pulled her onto her back so that the sun's dying rays shone on her face. Her eyes were the same steely blue as they had always been, but now were clouded over and lightless. The skin around them was red and puffy, like she'd just been crying, and one of her cheeks was mutilated by the exit wound of another bullet that had mortally pierced through her throat. The blood that ran from it had mixed with the tears that had previously streaked her face, and had only just begun to dry. They slaughtered her like an animal, Rambu thought, grief-filled rage beginning to bubble deep within him. They mutilated her, and just left her like this. He passed a bestial hand gently over her face, closing her eyes. After a moment of tearful silence, the devourer howled. It was an animalistic cry of fury, filled with an expression of mourning that was so profoundly and agonizingly human. It was directed both outwards towards the cruelty and injustice of this mad world, and inwards towards himself and his failings, his useless good intentions. You can't save them. Look at what happens when you try. Then what good am I? Why continue to try at all? Why continue on if all of my actions lead only to more death and destruction? The devourer slammed a clawed hand into the ice, shattering a hole in it with ease. It was about to shove its head into the frigid black waters and let the air slowly drain away from its lungs, allowing the current to whisk it away into the soft embrace of oblivion once more. But a sudden, excruciating electric shock caused it to convulse and fall backwards away from the aperture. It cried out in pain and curled in on itself, shuddering and breathing heavily. Stupid. They'd never let you get out of this that easily. Then what am I supposed to do? I can't help my friends, for every time I try, I seem to fuck things up more, and innocent people die. I can't just stay here, barely staving off starvation and not doing anything else, for then I'd be no better than that creature I killed. What the hell am I supposed to do? Charlie, Sneeg, and possibly even others are still out there, and I can't do anything! It is true that most of your actions so far have ended with death, but you can use that to your advantage. What do you mean? Let your friends save themselves. You, on the other hand, are better equipped to get something that they cannot. Freedom? No. You know as well as I that that is beyond your reach now. I'm talking about something sweeter. You're talking about revenge, aren't you? Slowly, the devourer pulled itself to its feet. The pain from the wound on its neck had faded to nothing more than a dull throb. That's right. Kill the ones responsible for this. You may not be able to save your friends. Only they can do that. But you can avenge them. And yourself. I'll make them pay. Not only will you make them pay, you'll prevent them from doing this to anyone else. You'll be a hero again. Remember the anger you felt in that facility? When you vowed to crush the director's skull between the iron jaws of his own creation? He felt the sensation of the drone's mask shattering under his bite, its blood pumping through his hands as they tore through its chest, the taste of its blood running down his throat. The memory invited the faint scratching of hunger to the forefront of his mind, and the lights on his mask began to flicker. Use it. Don't let it hinder you. Master it. Shofall made you into a weapon. No, it wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But it is what you are now. You have no other option but to accept it. Embrace it. The devourer wrenched its gaze away from the corpse of its slaughtered friend and turned it instead towards the edge of the lake. The last rays of the setting sun disappeared beyond the horizon of the valley in the distance, giving the many branches of the river that wended through it the appearance of bloody veins. Making their way towards him, silhouetted by the crimson twilight, were two armed figures. Even though their forms were darkened, the devourer's immaculate eyesight easily made out the blood that spattered the face of the one in front, and the patch on its chest bearing the hateful image of Shofall's logo. I'll take your heart and mind from you, just like you did to my friends, just like you did to me. The abomination raised itself on its hind legs, bared its many teeth, and roared. This time, the bellow was a challenge. The grief was gone. Only the rage remained. The other figure, its face obscured by a large hood and a cloth mask, raised the barrel of a rather odd-looking rifle at him. Before they could fire, the devourer fell onto its feet again and sprang forward like a pouncing mountain lion. Without a thought for the integrity of the ice, it thundered across the surface of the lake towards the two figures. The one with the rifle fired a few times, but missed completely. The other raised a smaller firearm, likely a pistol of some kind. The devourer lunged at the one with the patch that was covered in blood. The man rolled out of the way just in time, only narrowly avoiding having his head smashed between the abomination's iron jaws. As it readied itself for another attack, a sudden agonizing pressure began to build up in the devourer's ears. Evidently the two men felt it too, for both of them suddenly dropped their guns and raised their hands to their ears, reeling in pain. The devourer recovered faster, and was about to pounce forward again when, from out of nowhere, a sudden shockwave of heat and scarlet light threw it right off of its feet. The abomination raised itself up from where it had collapsed on the ice, its impact having formed a number of deep cracks in its surface, and shook its head to clear it. To its surprise, the air between it and its quarry had been torn asunder. Crimson light bled through a rift in space, refracting eerily from the shards of ice on the ground around it. The devourer snarled at this alien phenomenon, but its focus remained trained on the blood-stained man beyond it, who was only just now rising to his feet. Before it could maneuver its way around the rift, however, something large and heavy stepped from it. A foot of metal, wreathed and tangled in a mass of multicolored wires, landed with a crunch onto the ice, followed by another. Then, a gargantuan arm, also composed of machinery and cables, grasped the edge of the rift like a doorframe. Its massive claws glinted in the red light that oozed from within. The creature pulled itself free from the rift with a low and threatening rumble, mixed with the sound of white noise. A retro television atop its shoulders turned towards the devourer, revealing behind its shattered screen a familiar set of horrific humanoid teeth. Adam. The rift closed, taking the crimson light with it. If it had not been for the faint light of the moon that had begun to creep upwards in the sky, and the rhythmic glow from the sides of the devourer's mask, the lake would have been thrown into complete darkness. It's here to protect them. It won't save them from me. The abomination roared again and endeavored to dash around its opponent towards the man stained with the blood of his friend. But Adam moved with an unanticipated quickness and agility. As the devourer passed by, a number of cables shot out from Adam's forearms with incredible speed and latched around the beast's limbs, wrenching it to the ground with a crash. The devourer cried out in surprise as Adam gripped its body tightly with its claws and pinned its head to the ground. A cable began to wind its way around the abomination's neck, cutting off its airflow. It snarled and writhed for a moment, clawing desperately at the ice, before Adam opened its jaws and a thin white wire shot out from the back of its throat. It plunged sharply into the devourer's back, right into the port between its shoulders. Despite its struggle to breathe, the devourer roared at the two figures just beyond its grasp. The sound began to echo out from Adam's open jaws, distorted with static, but as the beast continued to howl, the sound warped and contorted. The animalistic cry faded, replaced by an anguished and enraged voice. A human voice. Rambu's voice. "I'll kill you for what you did to her! For what you did to all of them!" he screamed through Adam's mouthpiece. "You did this to me! It's all your fault! You turned me into a monster!" The bloodied figure stumbled a few steps backward toward the edge of the lake, and the hooded one studied him before he fell. Rambu stopped struggling for a moment, his eyes widening upon hearing the sound of his own voice again, and the grip of the cable around his throat lessened slightly. He immediately took that as an opportunity and sliced through the cable with his claws. Adam reeled and the wire disconnected from his back. Rambu picked himself up onto his feet and began to charge towards his target again. He leapt into the air, claws outstretched and mask fully opened, ready to sink his teeth into the man's throat. Before he could make contact, however, Adam knocked him out of the air. The two monstrosities clawed at each other as they fell, biting and howling like animals, and the momentum caused them to tumble right off of the edge of the frozen lake. Rambu barely registered the sound of the air rushing past his ears as he plummeted downwards. The thunderous impact into the frigid and frothing waters far below almost instantly ripped his consciousness away. The lights on his mask blinked briefly as he weakly grasped the surface for one last time before allowing himself to be pulled under. Maybe they'll let me stay dead this time. In the last moments before the blackness enveloped his mind, Rambu appreciated how blissfully quiet the waters were that consumed him. "I'll kill you for what you did to her! For what you did to all of them!" The familiar voice screamed out from the speaker behind the television monstrosity's gaping maw. Charlie stood frozen in place, like his feet were bolted to the ice, staring at the raging biomechanical being that was trying desperately to free itself from the choking grasp of the creature that restrained it. Its eyes, one of which reflected the eerie red light that emanated from its mask like an owl in the moonlight, bored into him with a look of pure, seething hatred and profound grief. The nausea returned as the concrete dam that had been built in his mind began to crack, and memories began to seep through it. He knew those eyes. They'd stared at him before, when he had been the one pinned underneath those same inhuman claws. Back then, the look of grief and pity and fear were for him. Now, they were because of him. "You did this to me! It's all your fault! You turned me into a monster!" More cracks began to form. Charlie's hands shook as he looked at the devourer's grasping claws. He felt the phantom grip of a knife in his palm. He heard his friend scream as he passed the blade through the tender flesh of his own hands. He felt the blood drip down his fingers as he passed wire after wire through the mutilated appendages. He saw his friend's frightened eyes, pleading at him to stop. The dam shattered, and the memories spewed forth in a torrential flood, drowning his senses and blurring his vision. Charlie's eyes clouded with tears as he stumbled backwards, overwhelmed by the crushing force of his anamnesis of times past. Sneeg immediately rushed to help him stay on his feet and not careen over the side of the waterfall that burst from the frozen precipice. His face was mostly obscured by his mask and hood, but his eyes betrayed the anguish and confusion that he was also experiencing right at that moment. Charlie looked at him with horror. "I saw you, lying dead in a hallway, killed by that thing. How are you here? With me?" Charlie subconsciously placed a hand to his side above the little white scar, the place where the monster had laced his own flesh with wires and took his own voice for itself. A screech of TV static brought him briefly back to his senses. The monster was reeling. One of its cables, the one that had been squeezing the air from the other abomination's throat, had been cut. No, not an abomination. His friend. He knew that face, those eyes, that voice. Now that the dam had burst, recognition dawned. Rambo? As the devourer lunged at him, its mask opened, revealing once more the rows upon rows of monstrous teeth that lined the mechanical paneling. At that moment, Charlie didn't have a thought for his own safety. He thought only of the teeth of the iron box that had closed upon his friend's face, the sound of rending flesh reverberating through the heart of the facility, the slow drip, drip, drip of the blood that had flowed down Rambo's neck and arms, still twitching with phantom animation but devoid of any real life. The sound of a collision refocused his mind. The TV monstrosity smashed into Rambo's side while in midair, narrowly preventing his claws from slicing Charlie's throat. The two great beasts tumbled to the ground, biting and tearing viciously at each other, and Charlie could only watch helplessly as the momentum of their movement sent them hurtling over the edge of the frozen precipice. The vagabond and renegade ran to the edge of the lake beside the roaring waterfall, just in time to see Rambo and the TV creature plunge into the river below with a loud splash. For a moment, Charlie could see Rambo clawing at the surface before the waters enveloped him, and the glow from his mask was lost entirely. A few seconds later, he spied the other creature as it pulled itself from the river, and shook itself like a dog before disappearing into the forest without a moment's hesitation. Without saying a word, Charlie retrieved his pistol from where the rift's shockwave had caused him to drop it, and began to climb down the steep hill. Sneak picked up his rifle and called after him. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" Charlie continued his descent. "We can't just leave him down there. He'll drown!" He didn't want to acknowledge the overwhelming sense of guilt that ate at the back of his mind just yet. Sneak craned his neck downwards to look Charlie in the eye. "He tried to kill you! He tried to kill both of us! We should be running in the opposite direction!" He pointed backwards as if to emphasize his point, but his eyes betrayed his genuine concern. "His name is Rambo, and you and I both know that. I saw your face. You remembered him too." He paused. "And I remembered you, Sneeg." A tidal wave of memories crashed against his mind, begging to be acknowledged. The cabin, the warehouse, the facility. He shook his head in an effort to clear it. "But we'll have to think about and process all of that later. All that matters right now is saving our friend. We can't waste any more time." Sneeg cursed silently to himself and bit his lip. "Fine. You're right. We'll talk about this later." He limped his way over to the steep hill and began to follow in Charlie's footsteps. The two of them climbed as quickly as was humanly possible down the sheer surface. Charlie even slipped a few times in his haste, as did Sneeg with his injured leg, but both were lucky that the snow was thick enough to properly cushion their fall. Upon reaching the bottom, they saw that Rambo's body had washed up on the side of the river. The frigid waters lapped around him like they were trying to draw him back into the black, icy depths. His eyes were closed, and Charlie couldn't see any movement from his chest. No, we can't be too late. We can't be." He ran over and immediately began to drag Rambo's body away from the grasping waters. He heaved and slipped on the slick river stones. In addition to already being much taller than him, the weight of Rambo's new metal additions made it almost impossible for Charlie to lift him on his own. Sneeg limped his way over, and, just like with the carcass of the young moose, the two of them managed to hoist up the body between them and carry it a safe distance away from the river's edge. Once they had laid Rambo's body out on a flat rock to support it, Charlie immediately began CPR chest compressions. "You're not going to die on me again. Not when I just got you back. Not if I can fucking help it." Christ, he's so thin I can see his ribs. What the hell have they done to him? He called out to Sneeg. "Get his mask open. He needs to breathe." While Charlie continued the chest compressions, Sneeg tried in vain to wrench open the mask's paneling with his fingers. "It's not budging!" he yelled in a panic. "Take my knife and pry it off, then!" Charlie yelled back at him. "I am not losing him again!" Sneeg reached over and took the combat knife from its sheath on Charlie's belt. As soon as he jammed the tip of the blade into one of the cracks between the mask's panels, a fizzing sound came out of nowhere. Before either of them could process what was happening, the lights on the sides of the mask flashed briefly but brightly, and a jolt of electricity shot through them all simultaneously. Sneeg yelped and instantly dropped the knife, and Charlie squawked and fell backwards onto the snow. Rambo's eyes flew open as he sat bolt upright, and he immediately started to expunge the river water from his lungs. His exhausted eyes met Charlie's for a very brief moment before they rolled back into his head, and he collapsed back onto the ground, unconscious, but breathing. Charlie's body felt numb. Did he recognize me? He sniffed and covered his face with his hands. He hadn't realized just how tired he was until now. Sneeg picked himself up from the ground and retrieved Charlie's fallen knife. He placed a hand on his friend's shoulder and handed the weapon back, hilt first. "He's alive, but we cannot stay here with him. Friend from a past life or not, you saw how he tried to attack us earlier. You did a good thing, coming down here to save him. But we need to go. We can't risk the chance that he might not recognize us when he wakes up again." Charlie nodded. Okay, you're right." Shakily, he rose to his feet and took the hilt from Sneeg, sheathing the blade once again on his belt. He sniffed again and pointed towards where he had seen the TV monstrosity exit the river. Whatever that other thing was, it may have hurt us before, killed us before. But for some reason or other, it did save our lives this time around. Our best chance of finding an exit would be to follow it. You want to go towards it? Unless you think aimlessly wandering in hopes of just stumbling upon a door is a better idea, then yes. Fine. Lead the way, Tracker Man. Luckily, the creature had entered the forest on the same side they were currently standing, so they didn't have to find a way to cross the river itself. Its large tracks were easy to spot. As the night darkened around them and a threatening storm began to brew on the horizon, the renegade and vagabond dove into the forest once more. Rembu blinked as his consciousness slowly returned. His head pounded as if a horde of tiny people armed with hammers were banging on the inside of his skull, trying to break it open. "I'm not dead? They'll never let you rest." He groaned as he sat up and began to shiver. His entire body ached like he was covered with one big bruise, and the biting chill he felt in his bones even extended to the joints and plates of his mechanical appendages. What the hell happened? As the fog cleared from his senses, he looked around at his surroundings. He was sitting on a large rock beside the bank of a river, its water dark and frothing from an icy waterfall that thundered into it from high above. Rambu's eyes followed the water upwards to its origin at the frozen precipice, but craning his neck upwards made him dizzy. He racked his brain in an effort to recall how he had managed to get all the way down here. I was attacking the shofar drone that killed Nikki. No, there were two of them. The other had a rifle. I was so close to finally getting my claws on them, but... He frowned, trying to remember, but his headache made it difficult. Adam. It was Adam. He just came out of nowhere. No, not nowhere. A rift. Rambu was reminded of the shallow crater he had seen while he'd been tracking the scent of blood to the lake, and how the second pair of footprints had seemingly just appeared at that exact spot. Maybe one of those drones came through a similar portal earlier on. Where do they lead to? A way out of this horrible place? He refocused his mind back on the fight. I was so close to avenging Nikki, but Adam got to me first. He stole your voice, just like he did to Charlie back in the facility. Rambu grimaced. No, not quite. He did take Charlie's voice, manipulated it, used it for himself, but not mine. Those words were my own. Even though he attacked and restrained me, I don't know. He was clearly protecting those drones, but I don't think he wanted to kill me either. He literally choked you. He could have killed me far more easily. I was furious. I don't think he could have stopped me if he didn't incapacitate me like that. His expression softened slightly as he raised his inhuman hand up and lightly brushed a claw against his throat. He didn't steal my voice. He gave it back, if only for a moment. And then threw you off a cliff. We both fell. If he hadn't collided with me, I would have killed that drone. He was protecting it. Rambu looked towards the river again, and remembered the cold embrace of the dark waters as they closed over his head. I passed out almost instantly. How the hell did I not drown? Did Adam save me? Did Adam save me? You tried to kill each other. Of course he didn't. And even if he did try to save you, didn't you want to die? I did. Before. And if I were faced with death again, I'd embrace it. But now that I've been given this chance to get back at the ones responsible for killing Nikki and turning us into this, I can't just lay down and die now. Not that Shofar would let me, even if I still wanted to. But how did I survive this time? He tried to hone the lens of his mind's eye. Rambu remembered the vague feeling of being dragged. No, lifted. A dull, rhythmic pressure on his chest. Then, suddenly, a white-hot, agonizing blast of electricity. Consciousness had returned to him ever so briefly at that moment, allowing him to cough up whatever water was in his lungs before he passed out again. No, there was something else. Someone was there. He winced as his head throbbed with the effort of trying to recall the face of the person who'd saved his life, and his mask flickered slightly. He could only bring to mind a blurred visage as it knelt over him, but one thing stood out crystal clear in his memory. The white patch with Shofar's logo. Rambu involuntarily vibrated his mask's panels in a low snarl as his anger began to flare up. That drone. It was he who brought me back. He who denied me rest. Of course. They just used my disciplinary trigger as a defibrillator to restart my heart. And they just left me here. The show must go on, of course. He stood up and began to pace along the bank of the river. His rising anger somehow helped to defrost his joints and made moving easier. But what do they even want from me? What do they want from Nikki? They made us into monsters, but why? The director mentioned a beta audience back in the surgical ward. What are they beta testing? There's no cameras anywhere, so they're not live streaming this nightmare like they were last time. A horrible thought dawned. What if they're trying to turn me into whatever Adam is? Make me a member of their security? The last audience elected against me joining the cast. I'm sure your crushed skull would hardly be fit for public consumption anyhow. Not exactly runway material. But then, that doesn't make any sense. Hetch literally had me kill and eat one of his drones. That kind of goes against the whole notion of being their security, doesn't it? If you're not security, then what are you? I don't know. Rambu paused his anxious pacing as he felt the wind pick up and a few snowflakes began to swirl around him. He looked up towards the sky, but couldn't see either the moon or the stars, a storm rapidly approaching. All I do know is that I need to find and kill those drones before they do to Charlie and Sneeg what they did to Nikki. Good. Hurt them like they hurt you. It's only fair. He scanned the snow on both sides of the river and the edge of the forest. His eyes alighted upon several clear sets of tracks, one large set, evidently left by Adam. He survived, then, and two smaller sets of footprints, slightly more recent. They followed him into the woods after they brought me back. Don't let them escape you again. As the snow began to fall faster and the winds blew harder, the devourer began its hunt once more. This time, it would not hesitate to close in for the kill. "There!" Charlie yelled backwards, trying to make himself heard over the howling gale that had descended upon the two travelers as they followed the creature's tracks out from the cover of the forest. "Are you sure we should just keep walking into the middle of a fucking snowstorm?" Sneak yelled in reply, teeth chattering as he struggled to remove her through the thick powder. His bloodied leg slowed his progress even further, but he refused to acknowledge it openly. The swirling snow had become so thick that the space around them looked like little more than a cold grey void. They likely wouldn't have been able to find their way back to the forest, even if they started to head back right at that moment, but Charlie could still just about make out the remnants of the creature's trail. They had to move quickly, though, or else it would be covered up for good. Charlie pointed. Up ahead, a faint and highly blurred red light managed to pierce through the dense gloom. It blinked rhythmically, refracting eerily through the frigid darkness. "It's the light we saw earlier from atop the lake! That TV thing was headed this way! It might be our ticket out of here!" "What if it's a trap?" Sneak called back. "Then I guess we just freeze to death," Charlie retorted as he pressed onwards towards the glow. As they approached, the light began to sharpen into a finer point. Charlie expected to see the outline of a building or something of that nature begin to take form, but there was nothing of the sort. Instead, to his surprise, he saw that the light was situated atop what looked like a vintage cast-iron lamp-post. He paused in his tracks out of confusion, and Sneak bumped right into his back. "Why'd you stop?" Sneak craned his neck upwards at the light, and his eyes widened. "They did not." "Did what?" In spite of the cold, his pain, and his obvious exhaustion, Sneak turned to Charlie with a look of genuine excitement. "They added the Narnia lamppost! This must be an exit. Look around for something. Anything." They found something, all right. Charlie hadn't spotted it right away due to the haze of the storm and the glare of the oddly placed and strangely colored street lamp, but situated next to it was what looked like an antique birdcage elevator from the 1920s, complete with a brass scissor door and paneled internally by beautiful vintage mahogany. How it could possibly function, Charlie couldn't hazard a guess, as it clearly wasn't attached to any other kind of structure. The tracks they had been following led right to it, and went no further. Sneak rattled the interlocking metal of the door while his fingers trembled in the cold, but it wouldn't budge. "Come on! This has to be our way out!" While the renegade fiddled with the door, trying to find some way to wrench it open, Charlie turned around to watch their surroundings. "There's got to be some kind of lock on here somewhere." Sneak?" Charlie said nervously, unholstering his pistol as he spoke. Another red light had begun to show itself amidst the swirling blackness of the storm behind them. Actually, two pairs of parallel red lights. They blinked, like a predator's eyes in the dark. "I found the keyhole," Sneak said triumphantly. "At least, what might pass as a keyhole. Doesn't look like anything I've ever seen before." Charlie stared at the lights as they began to draw closer, glowing brighter with every passing second, and his heart began to hammer faster in his chest. "You don't happen to have a key on you, do you?" Sneak pulled his rifle from his shoulder. "We won't need one when I have this. Stand back." Before Charlie could say a word, Sneak fired a shot directly at the lock. The ferrobullet, instead of destroying the lock as Sneak had hoped, ricocheted loudly backwards into the darkness. Upon inspecting the lock, it wasn't even dented. "What the fuck? That should have obliterated it, especially from this distance." A mechanical snarl interrupted his frustrated remarks. Slowly, Sneak turned his back on the birdcage. Through the howling winds and swirling snow, the blurred form of the devourer stalked ever closer, and the lights on its mask cast a blood-red glow onto its metal forelimbs. "Rambo?" Charlie said nervously, teeth chattering in part because of the cold and in part because of his rising panic. He forced the latter down, raised one hand up, and pointed the pistol down to the side with his other, in an effort to seem less aggressive, but not defenseless. "It's us. Sneak and Charlie. We're your friends, right?" "Charlie!" Sneak hissed to him, eyes wide with fear. "We have to get out of here!" I'm not giving up on him. He's still in there, somewhere. Charlie stood his ground as the devourer began to close the distance between them, dragging its claws over the snow like a leopard on the prowl. Its mask was partially open, and it clacked its lower mandibles together threateningly. If it had hackles, they would have been raised. "Charlie!" The devourer rose to its full height and roared before dropping back onto its feet and charging towards them with all the speed and malice of a rampaging bear. "Charlie!" Shit, shit, shit! Charlie's mind was thrown into full panic mode. He immediately racked his brain for some kind of solution. Do I run? Do I shoot? Do I hide? Do I plead? Do I lay down? Do I die? What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? When something suddenly struck his memory. As the devourer thundered towards them, Charlie whirled around to Sneak. "Give me the hilt!" "The what?" "The MacGuffin!" He didn't wait for Sneak to process his words, and instead Charlie just shoved his hand into one of his friend's many jacket pockets. With some marvelous stroke of luck, he had picked the right one. His hands closed around the strange wooden grip that was the hilt of the broken portal knife, the one he had attached the obscure metal piece to that they had retrieved off of the Siren's corpse. Without another moment's delay, he shoved the notched metal end into the odd-looking keyhole and twisted. As smooth as butter, the brass scissor door opened itself with a musical ding. "Go, go, go!" Charlie shoved Sneak inside the birdcage elevator, yanked the MacGuffin back out from the keyhole, and slammed the brass door shut as soon as they both stepped inside. Not a moment too soon. The very moment the scissor door had locked itself back in place, the devourer collided with it with a force that could have easily caused any other normal barrier to have shattered completely. It snapped at the interlocking bars with its jaws, howling with rage. If Charlie and Sneak hadn't pressed their backs as flat as they could against the vintage wood at the back of the elevator, they would have been sliced to ribbons by the devourer's claws as they poked through the gaps in the door like knives. With the stock of his rifle, Sneak just about managed to slam a random button on the elevator's internal console. Another mahogany slab that seemed to come from nowhere slid between the inside of the elevator and the brass door, shielding them at last from the stabbing claws of the raging animal outside that had once been their friend. The whole structure shuddered, and Charlie got the sensation that it had begun to rise upwards. After a moment, they both collapsed upon the floor of the elevator, breathing heavily and staring at nothing, minds desperately trying to process the events of the past few hours. Now that he had finally reached a place that felt somewhat secure, where he didn't feel like he was immediately going to be frozen to death, stabbed, shot, or eaten if he wasn't constantly alert, Charlie pressed his back against the wall, clutched his knees tightly to his chest, and screamed. It was a cry of pain, of mourning, of despair, of anger, and of guilt. All of the feelings he had kept bottled up inside over the past few days, no, the past few months, or however long it had been since the events in the cabin took place, were suddenly unleashed in that one primal expression of raw human emotion. Following that, he sobbed until his voice was hoarse and his eyes had no more tears left to shed. Sneak sat there with him through it all without a word, but kept a comforting arm wrapped around his shoulders. They continued to sit there, motionless, long after the elevator had come to a stop with another dulcet chime. "Congratulations, player. You have reached level 3. Continue game."